So, one of the things that we were talking about before as well is that Ravi Zacharias had used certain tactics of keeping women quiet and also keeping them kind of on the hook when he had begun these sexual relationships with them. And one of his main tactics was using shame and fear. So he would say things to them like, well, you know, if you come forward, you'll be responsible for thousands of people losing their faith. Or he would just use his position as a ministry authority to basically confuse people and to make them think like, is this a really wrong thing to do? He would say things like, well, hey, you know, David had concubines, and you know, you should be thanking God that I have the ability to relieve some of my stress with you sexually. So he used certain tactics like that. Or there was just the underlying threat of he owned the massage parlor so he could get them fired. Or he is such a well-known religious authority that would anyone believe me if I came forward? Wouldn't they just accept Ravi's word over mine? And if I do come forward, people will think that it's my fault, that I, you know, led him on, or I was asking for it, or something like that. So there's all this fear, there's all this shame. Do you see that pretty regularly with predators like this?
Yeah, like I think, I don't know if I'd mentioned it before in one of the other things that we were talking about, but most definitely, I think I think I mentioned this, that we question our own reality in all of this as well. So all of these things are going on and these things are being said, but questioning our own reality, like, is this even really true? Maybe I've made more of it than I thought, and I don't want it to be true.
Yeah.
You know, I really respect this man, and he's right. Who am I? I'm a nobody.
Yeah.
And he's a man of God, and so maybe it is not true. And so you just keep going along until you've crossed the line where you know it's no longer, but you've already gone along.
Right. And now the fear of stopping or coming forward is so terrifying. It's so, like, I don't think I could do it, that you just keep going along to get along.
Well, there's also shame involved because, you know, if you're married or if he has nude pictures of you, I mean, that's all going to be exposed. And we know what happens most of the time when women are violated. They are looked upon by society as they had a part. And I'm not saying they don't always have a part, but many times they don't. And even if they did, it's still not an excuse for what took place.
Right.
And so we've seen it happen where the women are smeared.
Yeah.
And so what's the incentive to do that, to come forward?
I think even biblically there's that scene in John 8 where the woman caught in adultery is brought before Jesus.
Exactly. Where's the man?
Yeah, that's right. The man's conspicuously missing.
Right.
And everybody in that group seems to be okay with it. Like, no one seems to be like, whoa, wait, where's the guy?
Right.
You know, no one asks that question. No one even looks at that any deeper. It's just the idea of this woman did it. And I think that, you know, in the church and outside of the church, there is that almost thought process where men have, and it's a weird thought process, where it's like men have kind of like this lustful inclination, and it's women's job to keep us honest.
Yeah.
You know, it's women's job not to arouse that lust.
There's almost like an excuse for them built in.
That's
and
right.
So, of course they're the gas. We're supposed to be the brakes.
That's right.
Yeah. That's how I put it.
I've never heard that before. It's really good. But, you know, and it, you know, obviously this is a tragic thing, but it brings about that victim shaming, where the woman, even if the man was more responsible, the woman feels more responsible. Of, you know, like, oh my gosh, like, I'm a homewrecker. Right. I'm this, I'm that. And it's like, even if the man initiated it, even if the man groomed her, even if the man was using authority to get her in that position, she still feels like, this is on me. And I think that also kind of feeds into something that we talked about earlier, where these predators tend to pick or select women that are not only like receptive, but also women that are hollow in a way. Women who already struggle with a deep amount of insecurity and a feeling that they're not worthy. So that already like pre-validates what they already think about themselves. Right.
Yeah. And again, I don't want to overlap on what we said, but I definitely agree, because I'm thinking about clients that I have, and I think about the predisposition given like what family of origin issues happened. And if they've been told their whole life that they are worth nothing,
Yeah.
which I have someone that is currently has experienced that, then it's such a confusing time because like, well, of course he's going to do this to me. This is what I'm worth.
Right.
And so it was my fault. So for me to come forward, I can't.
Yeah. And then, some guys, they utilize, so he worded it this way, but obviously a lot of men are not going to be in his position to word it this way, but he said, if you come forward, you're going to be responsible for thousands losing their faith. Now, most men can't say something like that,
That's
but a more common one that I hear is like, if you leave me, I'm going to hurt myself, or I'm going to hurt others. And there's a responsibility built in there towards the woman of, you're responsible for me and my actions.
Yeah.
And if you leave me, you're responsible for what happens next.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I don't see as much as people saying they're going to kill themselves, but like more putting the blame on them is kind of what I hear you saying too,
Right.
in that, if you leave me, like you're going to cause my wife to, or if you tell, you're going to cause my wife to leave me, you're going to ruin our families, you're going to ruin your family.
Yeah.
And so it's like her fault. That I see a lot more of that, and more than like the killing of themselves or hurting themselves. But I do feel like, again, it's about that blame, and why is it that the woman takes the blame?
Yeah.
She will take the blame. And like you said, it could be all the way back from biblical times. We see that that's just the norm. The guy is supposed to do these things. Those are expected. We built in that little place for him to be able to do that, but it's not, the woman's not allowed.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because, again, you go back to the original sin in the garden, and what do you see? Even Adam and Eve, they share an equal responsibility, but then what does Adam say? The woman you gave me,
right.
She caused me to sin, and
Right.
Eve doesn't stand up for herself.
Yeah.
That's the interesting thing. So she blames the serpent,
Right.
but she never says, well, hey.
He was a man. He's a leader.
Yeah, like, where were you? Like,
Right.
you were supposed to protect me from these things. Like,
Right. It is true, yeah.
And it's this weird, like, twisted thing where we see that the authority that God gave man, because God gave authority to man, was used to actually abdicate responsibility for action. And we see a reversal of that over and over again in the Bible. So whenever someone does that, you see God judge that person more harshly. So a couple examples that come to mind are the book of Numbers, where the children of Israel refused to go into the land, and they used their kids as an excuse. They say, oh, well, if you make us fight this war, then our kids are going to suffer. They're going to be orphans. They're going to be thrown into slavery. You don't care about our kids, so we're not going through. And God's like, no. You're using your kids as a scapegoat. It's your fear. It's your issue. So therefore, they're going to get to go in and you're not.
Yeah.
And that's why he makes them wander for 40 years. Or in the book of Hosea, God looks at the men and he says, you have treated your daughters like harlots, and you as husbands have gone into harlots. So therefore, I'm not going to punish the women for their actions, but I am going to punish you. So God's not saying the women are off the hook. It's not their fault.
Right.
But he is saying you carry the bigger responsibility for that sin, and therefore I'm going to judge you more harshly. So I like how God does that and reverses that. And,
Yeah.
Do you think that's like an important thing for a woman to know in situations like this?
It's interesting that you say that, because I hadn't really thought about that ever before. So if I haven't thought about that, that's probably not being taught, So really, I think, this is important if they're watching this video to know that. But that, even knowing that, we have to override all of this that's been built up. So you know how hard it is to override something that's been ingrained in you, that it is your fault.
Right.
That you're and that's why when we look at things that happen, that, like we were talking about the Grammys and the things that are being shown on TV, like why people can say like this is such a great thing for women, because they think that that's overriding, but actually it's degrading women.
Yeah.
So they're trying to override, but in the wrong way.
Right.
Or so they say, or maybe it's just all about money.
That's right. So in other words, I think what you're getting at is this idea of empowerment in our society. Is we're empowering women by showing them that they have sexual autonomy. But what's interesting, and me and Bo talk about this a lot, is that supposed women's empowerment is male-led.
Absolutely.
Meaning that the people that are producing the music, the people that are writing the videos are men, and the consumers are all men.
Right.
Meaning that not that there aren't women that are consuming it.
That's true.
But the majority of people who want to see that and want to hear that are the men who want to objectify the women. So I always find it like incredibly ironic that a woman is saying we're more than the sum of our body parts.
Right.
We want to be taken seriously, and we don't want men to objectify us. But then they produce content that is specifically geared towards objectifying themselves before men.
Right. And so what they're saying is like, yeah, we can objectify ourselves. And you're like, well, wait, what are you talking about? Like we can use our bodies, because you don't see the men up there doing those same acts.
Right.
It's just the woman.
Right. And even if the men did it, that doesn't make it good. You know?
Well, and honestly, most of them, like, that's not really that. Like, even women are watching the women,
right.
Not as much as the men.
Right.
So my point of that too is like saying like these women think these type of things are empowering them.
Right.
But if you even look at the acts themselves, they are most of the time degrading to women, not to men. Yeah. They're degrading to women.
And I think about, like there's this really interesting Bible passage in Isaiah where God is speaking of the gospel. He's speaking of the coming of Messiah. And he says, in those days, they will say to the barren woman, rejoice, O barren woman, for the children of the barren woman are more fruitful than the woman who has borne her own. And in our society and culture, we don't really grab what he's saying. Mm-hmm. But what he's getting at is back in that day, a woman's value system wasn't really on her appearance. There was a little of that.
Yeah.
But because of betrothals and arranged marriages and things like that, the majority of the value placed upon women was their ability to produce heirs, was their ability to produce children, specifically male heirs. Mm-hmm. And that's why you see in the Bible where a lot of women are suicidal, like no joke suicidal, because they can't have kids. I think about Hannah, I think about Rachel, I think about Sarah, where they're so distraught about not being able to have children that they actually feel like they want to die. And now in our society, a woman who is barren, that's a tragic thing. It's a horrible thing. I know that women are very grieved by that for sure.
Right.
But I don't see the same societal pressure of you must be cursed of God if you can't have kids.
Well, and the reason you don't see that too, or the reason you can say you don't see that, because there are many women who choose not to have kids now. That didn't happen back then.
That never happened back then.
Right.
But what I do see more of in our society, if I were to say like, what's the majority of reason why girls do go into like self-harm, bulimia, anorexia, things like that, or even become suicidal, it is because of their appearance. Because what our society said is, no, your value is based upon your appearance, what you look like.
Right.
And that's incredibly damaging. And when we think about that in the context of the gospel, though, and what Isaiah is saying, he's saying when Messiah comes, what's going to happen? The barren woman is going to be able to rejoice. In other words, what he's prophesying is there's coming a day when a woman's value is not going to be predicated on her ability to bear children, but it's only going to be based on what the Messiah sees in her. So in other words, the Messiah is going to produce some sort of a value in the woman that overrides her societal value and gives her a greater feeling of worth and value. And we see the biblical authors in the New Testament writing about that, where they were a lot of times writing to a Greek audience, which was more like ours, where it was about looks. That's why you got 1 Peter 3, where he says, don't let your adornment be merely outward, the arranging of your hair, the adornment with jewels. He says, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, which is incorruptible before God, and in whom God is well pleased. So you see this idea where Peter's saying, don't let your value system be about your outward appearance. Instead, let it be about what God sees in you. And I feel like the more that women are able to receive that and accept that, the more their value system raises, and the more they don't feel like my responsibility is to please the man, or to feel like almost like a naturalness to being used and objectified by men.
And I think what also is like the struggle is because God did create women to be helpers, and so like what happens is there's this, whether you're a believer or not, there's this underlying piece that he's put in us to be that way. So we get it mixed up. Helping meaning like now I'm to be used. Right. Helping with anything. Right. Even helping your bad behavior. Right.
Which is why addiction recovery circles, you see more women become enablers than men. Where it's not that it's unseen where a man is an enabler towards his wife, but it's very rare. It's much more common that the woman has become the enabler in the relationship.
Yeah.
And you know, even this, and this is going to sound kind of strange to maybe some women listening to this, but if you stay and if you do not go forward, regardless of the heavy consequences, because there probably are going to be heavy consequences, there is an enabling aspect there, meaning that you are
helping
allowing
the behavior to continue.
The behavior to continue.
Yeah, and that's so difficult because then again, it's your fault.
Right.
You know, so like, but if you can be empowered by that, by saying, regardless of the consequences, as we talked before, to my consequences, my family, his, like, I have to come forward.
Right.
And regardless of what he's saying, I know this to be wrong.
Right.
I have to come forward.
And in a weird way, you know, like I said, for a woman, you know, there's that filter in a lot of people's eyes that are being used this way of like, it's my fault, it's my fault, it's my fault. Where when you said it, you're like, no, this is actually like an empowering thing. Where it's actually not your fault that this has happened, but instead you have the power to stop it.
Right.
And so it's a different thing than saying you're responsible for it continuing.
Right.
As opposed to saying you actually have the power to make it end.
Right.
Which puts you in the driver's seat. It puts you in the position where, in other words, for the entirety of the situation, you've been in like a passive bystander where these things are being, or participant, where these things are being done to you and you feel like you don't have power at all.
Right.
Where now, actually what we're saying is you do have power.
Yeah.
You have the power to stop it. There might be consequences, but
right.
ultimately it's worth it.
Right. And I think, and even if your one voice doesn't stop it, and we see that in culture today, like one voice might not stop it, but it might give others courage to come forward as well.
Yeah.
Because they've seen your courage, what it took for you to do that.
Yeah. And, you know, I do want to mention this briefly. We talked about this a little bit last time, but power seems to be something that is addictive. And just as men have used their power to subjugate women, what we're seeing today, and this guy named Shelby Steele, he talks a lot about it, and he's got a lot of good books on it. He himself is an African-American man, and he talks about how the oppressed in America have now become oppressors to a certain extent. And what he mentions is, he says, when someone received victim status back in the day, that was considered a shameful thing. When someone was victimized, you were considered less than, you were considered damaged. It actually took your power. But nowadays, he says, there's been a reversal, where to be a victim is actually to give you power. And he said there's a good thing in that, because it's more empowering to victims, and it's more empowering to get them to be able to speak out and to be able to stop oppression when they see it. But he said the temptation of it is to then take that power and to use it in order to subjugate others. And so what, you know, I've seen in the last couple of years, and maybe you have too with the Me Too movement, what I love about the Me Too movement is that more women are speaking out. But what I'm scared of with the Me Too movement is that some women who have not been oppressed or victimized are claiming that status in order to get people fired, to basically ruin people's lives, and that power has become attractive to them. Have you seen that too?
Yeah, and I am sad about that, because what happens is that is damaging to true victims.
Right.
To true people who have been perpetrated. I like that word better, because I just feel like it's not as like when we take on that idea of victims.
Like less than.
But I feel like it truly damages that. It's similar about like calling everybody a racist.
Right.
You know, like the power of like what racism really means, it diminishes those people who really did suffer from racism. Just because you say something that's maybe I don't like and I call you a racist, you know, or you're white, so you're a racist, that diminishes that power. So I feel like for those people who are using it for their own power, it saddens me, because it also gives women less credibility in the long run. You know, our victims or perpetrated people, less credibility. But I do see that, and have seen that. We see that in the media. We've seen it where people in colleges have been falsely accused, and so these women, obviously, that do that, maybe there has been something in their past, you know, maybe that they have been victimized, and they realize that these people have been given power by this, so they jump on that and lie about that and ruin people's lives.
Yeah, and that could be a really scary thing. So
Yeah.
we have to see that balance where, you know, as a culture, we shouldn't see people who are perpetrated as being greater than,
Right.
but we also shouldn't see them as being lesser than.
Right.
We should just see them as people, that there's an equality there.
Right.
And that's the balance where before I feel like we erred on the idea of shaming people for being victimized, but
Right.
now I think we're erring on the side of empowering people who have been perpetrated. And I
Like
feel like there's
too much.
like too much.
Yeah.
Where there should be a level of empowerment, but the
Right.
empowerment should actually just make them feel like they're on the same level as
Right.
everybody, not to make them feel like they're superior to other people, and therefore they have a greater voice, greater authority, greater power, and people ought to listen to them
Right.
simply because of what they've been through.
Yeah, I agree.